A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Must one eat bread and drink wine at Seuda Shlishit?
The answer to that question, or those two questions, is yes and no. In other words, with regards to bread, the answer is yes. With regards to wine, the answer is no. Let us begin first with the wine, because that is the simpler of the two. There is no statement anywhere in Chazal, not in the Mishnah or the Talmud or the Tosefta, that one must make kiddush, for example. If we're talking about kiddush, as some people, certain authorities claim that one should make a kind of kiddush at Seuda Shlishit, there is no mention of any such idea. And even the Rambam, who does mention drinking wine, does not say anything about kiddush. What we find in the Talmud, and this is apparently the basis for the statement of the Rambam, which I will read in a moment, what we find in the Talmud, in Masechet Berachot, Daf Mem Bet, is the fact that the Mishnah states there that Berech al hayayin shelifnei hamazon patar et hayayin shel ahar hamazon. In other words, in those days it was common that when one had a banquet or a special meal, the guests arrived and they were offered wine as an appetizer, an aperitif, and other savories, etc. And then later they would do netilat yadayim, wash their hands, and sit down to the main part of the meal. And towards the end of the meal, as part of the dessert, with the dessert they would drink wine. And the Mishnah states that when one makes the bracha on the wine before the meal, at the initial stages of the banquet, one has in mind the fact that one will also be drinking wine later, at the end of the meal, and therefore that is included in the bracha that one makes at the beginning, and therefore one is not required to make another bracha on the wine later in the meal. And the Talmud mentions that this halacha applies either at a special kind of meal where everyone knows this is going to be the case, or on Shabbat and Yom Tov, kashe adam koveh et asmo al hayayin. In other words, where a person makes the choice and has the intention of drinking wine during the meal and at the end of the meal. Even from this source, we cannot learn that there is a chovah, a requirement to drink wine. The Talmud is describing what was the common practice, the usual custom of people in those days, and it is a very fine custom because drinking wine at a meal, as everyone knows, lends a certain atmosphere, aura of importance and formality even to the meal, and this is therefore a nice idea on Shabbat for Seuda Shlishit as well, but it's not a chovah. And the words of the Rambam also do not imply that this is a chovah. So with regards to the question, does one have to drink wine at Seuda Shlishit, the answer is no. And this is also true according to the view of the Rambam, which we will read in a moment. With regards to the other question, does one have to eat bread at Seuda Shlishit? The answer is yes. One does need to do so. This is based on a number of facts. First of all, the fact that Chazal nowhere make any distinction between the first, the second, and the third meal of the Shabbat. And therefore the simple understanding of this halakha is as the Rambam understands it, as Rabbeinu Yitzhak Ba'alat Tosafot, quoted by the Tur in Siman Resh Sadi Aleph, understands it. The simple understanding is that all the meals are equal in terms of their basic requirements. In other words, that it is necessary to have bread, it is necessary to have lechem mishnah, even though lechem mishnah is a separate issue which we need to discuss on another occasion. And there is no suggestion that the third meal is somehow of a lower order and therefore does not require bread. As with wine, bread eaten at a meal suggests that the meal is an important one and has a certain aura of importance and perhaps even formality about it, and bread is therefore required at all three meals on Shabbat. There are those poskim who have suggested that for the third meal one can perhaps suffice with mine teragema, or mine targima, as people usually pronounce it. And this is suggested by Rabbanei Tzorfat, that is to say, some of Baalei Tosafot, quoted by Rabbeinu Yonah, for example, in Masechet Berachot, and certain other Rishonim. But many Rishonim reject this opinion, and really there is no basis. For this understanding. And even when it comes to the meaning of the term minei taragema, there is no real agreement as to what this means. Some have interpreted this term to mean foodstuffs made of hameshet haminim, made of flour, of wheat flour usually. So we're talking about some kind of baked product. This is the view of the Rosh, for example, and the Tosafot, but this is unfortunately based on an incorrect reading of the Tosefta and Masechet Berachot Perek Daled. There they read that the Baraita speaks about a person who was presented, who had placed before him minei taragema, and that he makes the bracha borei minei mezanoth. But the correct Girasa, which implies, of course, if it's borei b'nei mezanoth, that we're talking about some kind of baked product, some kind of biscuit or cake or something of the sort. But in fact, the correct Girasa is that when a person is presented with minei taragema, he makes the bracha borei minei kesanin, which is a bracha which is not very well known today, but this is how it appears in the Tosefta, and this is how it appears in all the accurate sources, in Rabbeinu Hananel and the Aruch, etc., etc., and most of the and all the Kitvayad, essentially, all the manuscripts, and even in some of the printings. And therefore, the correct Girsa shows that this understanding is not true. Minei taragema does not refer to mezanoth. It refers to different kinds of dried fruits and nuts and the like, things that are eaten as dessert, items that are eaten as part of the dessert at the end of a meal. And these kinds of things, basically snack food, is what the Gemara refers to when it speaks about minei taragema. The suggestion of this is sufficient for Seuda Shlishit is really without any solid basis and is rejected by a majority of the Rishonim. And this is also the maskana, the conclusion of the Tur. Rabbeinu Yaakov Bar Turim brings these opinions, the end of Siman Reis Hadi Aleph, and he writes, "V'yesh omorim, there are those who say, she'achol lahashlim Seuda Shlishit b'minei taragema." There are those who say you can perform this mitzvah of the third meal by eating minei taragema. And he explains, Perush ma'achal he'asui me'hameshet minei dagan. And this refers to a food made of the 5 species of grain, that is to say, made of flour, as we explained a moment ago. And as we just explained, this interpretation, this understanding of the term is incorrect. Then he goes on to say, to reject this former opinion, he says, Rabbeinu Yitzhak, Baalei Tosafot, the famous Rabbeinu Yitzhak, the nephew of Rabbeinu Tam, היה אומר, כיוון דילפנן 3 סעודות מ3 פעמים היום דכתיבי גבי מן, seeing that the concept of 3 סעודות is learnt from the pasuk, which mentions the word hayom, today, 3 times. We're speaking about the man in the desert. צריך לעשותה בפת, one has to therefore lend the same importance and the same standard to each of these 3 meals, and therefore bread is required. This is the maskana, this is the conclusion of the Tur, as the Beth Yosef and the Bach both understand it, and this is also what we find in the Rambam. Rambam writes in Perek Lamed Arichot Shabbat Halachat Teth, speaking about the 3 meals, he says, وَصَرِيخ لِكْبُعَ كُلْ سُعُدَى مِشَلُشْتَانْ عَلْ هَيَيْن. Here the Rambam says that one must or should drink wine at each of these 3 meals. I've already mentioned that it is very dubious whether this in fact is a hovah. What we find in the Talmud, as I said, is the clear implication. This is what people usually did. And that was probably because the custom in those days was, at any important meal, people used to drink wine. But today, not all people are used to this practice, and not all people like to drink wine with every meal necessarily. And if a person doesn't feel like drinking wine, he's not required to drink wine. And then the Rambam goes on to say, one is required to have lechem mishneh, which means bread, 2 loaves of bread, or 2 bread rolls, or pitot, at each of these 3 meals. This is the view of the Rambam. And therefore this is, as I said, in line with the conclusion of Rabbeinu Yitzhak Baalei Tosafot, quoted by the Tur. And this is also the conclusion of the Shulchan Aruch, in this siman, the rest of the aleph, he says, "Sarich la'asotah b'fath." One must make this meal on bread. And then he brings the other opinions, that one may make it on mezonot, and there are those who say you can do it on things like bread and fish and cheese, etc., without bread. This is another opinion which appears in some of the Rishonim, like the Rosh and the Tosafot. This opinion also apparently is not correct. The term mineh taragema comes from the Greek word, which refers to foods which are eaten as part of dessert. Now, everyone knows one does not eat meat and fish as dessert at the end of a meal, and therefore this interpretation also seems to be without basis. And then he goes on to say there are those who say yesh omrim afilu beferoth, one can even by eating fruit, etc., one can perform this mitzvah. And then he says usfara rishona ikar, the first opinion, namely that one must make this third meal on bread, is true, is the more correct opinion. And this is what one should do, unless one is particularly full and really unable to eat after the former meal or what have you, one is not feeling up to eating anything beyond some kind of snack food, then one should make the third meal on bread. And therefore a person should plan his day in such a way that he will be able to eat the third meal and eat at least one kazait, the minimal requirement for each of these meals. As we said, each of these meals must be made on bread. The minimal requirement is to eat a kazait. A kazait of bread is actually a very small amount of bread. In fact, many people will be surprised perhaps to know that a kazait is actually the volume of one olive, which the average kind of olive that Chazal were referring to, the volume of such an olive is 3 cc. In other words, we're talking about a very small bite of bread indeed, something approximately approaching a sixth or something of an average slice of bread. So we're talking about something very small indeed, not something major. A person has to be really rather ill or terribly uncomfortable in the way he feels, etc., in order not to be able to do at least that. And therefore, in conclusion, all the 3 meals must be made on bread. The minimal requirement is a kazait, and wine is not an absolute requirement, but it is a nice idea.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.